So, down in Florida, there are public school teachers alarmed about how the state wants them to teach civics to their students. In Republican Governor Ron DeSantis' version of American history and governance, church and state not so separate, and the Constitution should be interpreted through the lens of originalism. That idea that everything the Founding Fathers believed in 1787, a long time ago, should take precedence over everything we might have learned since then. Which brings us to the topic of slavery. When I sat down with Florida high school teacher Tatiana Album just before the school year began, she walked me through the official state education department training on the subject of slavery. The only thing I can find in this slide, in this entire presentation about enslaved people, it's one slide, and it says less than 4% of slavery in the Western Hemisphere was in colonial America. The number of enslaved people increased in America through birth. What is happening here in this slide?
Yeah, so this is a map kind of showing how the transatlantic slave trade brought enslaved people to both of the Americas. There's a heavy emphasis that those people were brought to South America.
It's a much bigger arrow.
Right, and where we're at in North America, you know, our colonies are a very small sliver. And there was this heavy emphasis that most of our enslaved people were born here, almost to say it was less bad.
To enslave children.
Right, right.
For generations.
To say they were born here, we didn't steal them and bring them on a boat, is kind of what it felt like.
Sort of making a difference between slaves born in the United States and those born in Africa, and suggesting somehow that slave life, that our moral debt is less because they were born into slavery as opposed to snatched from their homes.
Yes, that's definitely how I felt they were portraying this information.
And also that less than 4% of slavery in the Western Hemisphere was in colonial America. Is that to minimize the number of slaves that were here, which still numbered in the millions?
I believe so.
This slide says 2/3 of the founders held slaves. Even those that held slaves did not defend the institution of slavery. In November 1789, Benjamin Franklin described slavery as an atrocious debasement of human nature. Did they give you the source of the 2/3 of the founders?
They did not.
Who didn't even approve of slavery?
Yeah, they did not, which was odd because there was this heavy focus on primary sources. And so to be given the information without the source, how can I take that back other than in my head? You know, how can I take that back to my students in a tangible way if I'm supposed to be relaying this information to them?
And then, this is the slide you were talking about. George Washington saying, "It being among my first wishes to see some plan adopted by which slavery in this country may be abolished by law. The abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in those colonies where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state."
Right.
So what's happening here?
Well, these are two men that, you know, are known to be slave owners. You know, Thomas Jefferson and the people he enslaved, it's notorious, you know, it's a huge topic of discussion. So it's really interesting to see them position these two specific figures with quotes that aren't sourced, saying they opposed slavery, knowing
they owned slaves.
They owned slaves.
And at least one of them raped a slave.
Right.
But this seems to be the framing here, which is that slave owning in America wasn't as bad as it was elsewhere. The slaves that were owned were born into slavery.
Right.
And the people who owned them did so reluctantly.
Right.
My next guest is the person to talk about the teaching of history and race in America. He has been a longtime staff writer at The New Yorker, providing analysis on everything from politics to policing. During his time at The New Yorker, he has also co-edited The Matter of Black Lives, a collection of the magazine's most groundbreaking pieces on Black history and culture, featuring the works of renowned writers like James Baldwin and Toni Morrison. He has also authored numerous books, reported for a Peabody Award-winning documentary series. Oh, and he has also recently been named the Dean of the Columbia School of Journalism. Joining us now is the great Jelani Cobb. Thank you, Professor, for joining me.
Thank you.
So there is a lot to talk about here. A lot. I want to start with that slide that seems to minimize America's role in the transatlantic slave, and this notion that descent-based slavery was somehow perhaps better or less morally egregious than the initial slave boats that brought slaves over to the New World, if you will. Sociologist and law professor Dorothy Roberts explains what descent-based slavery actually meant in the Americas.
The short word is breeding.
Yes.
But breeding human beings like livestock.
Yes, and I'll read a quote from her book, right? So Virginia decides that enslaved black women give birth to enslavable children, even if those children are white. And she writes, that law allowed white men to profit from their sexual assaults on black women. Freed from the worry that their mixed-race offspring had any legal claim to freedom, white men could rape enslaved women with total impunity, maintaining their domination while increasing their wealth. Their control over black women's bodies was key to creating a permanent labor supply.
That's right.
That reality has no place in the civics training. What does this mean? Practically speaking?
I mean, practically speaking, it is a mechanism by which lies can be given the cloak of truth. And so if we want to go back to that document about there only being 4% of the people brought in the transatlantic slave trade to the North American colonies, that's technically true. What they don't talk about is the fact that the British were late to the transatlantic slave trade. And so when we talk about 1619 and the 1619 project, that's more than a century after people, particularly the Spanish and the Portuguese, had been bringing enslaved people to Brazil, had been bringing them to the Caribbean, had been bringing them throughout South America. That's why there were fewer. And so when you get to the other part about the descent-based slavery versus trafficking and kidnapping people, that is motivated by the small thing called the Haitian Revolution, which sent shockwaves throughout the slave-holding world, where Haiti, this island, which was overwhelmingly populated by enslaved black people, launched a revolution and overthrew their French overseers. And this terrified slaveholders throughout the West. And so you began to see a push to say that there needed to be an abolition, not of slavery, but specifically an abolition of the transatlantic slave trade.
Yes. Because
places like South Carolina already had a majority black population. There were more black people in South Carolina than there were white people in South Carolina. This made people paranoid. And so they ended the transatlantic slave trade and then continued to keep people enslaved and through the process of reproduction, which led to people being bred like livestock, as I said earlier. And so they are using a cloak of humanity to disguise utter inhumanity.
I wonder, when you look at these moments when you have the sort of white patriarchs offering a revisionist history, lost cause, after the Civil War. And again, this sort of revisionist history and white apologia for white enslavement happens again in the Civil Rights era when we feel like progress is being made. Do you think that's what's happening now? That the DeSantises of the world, that the organizations that are working to implement this kind of teaching in schools are doing so because they feel like progress is on the doorstep?
Absolutely. This is the old dictum that he who controls the past controls the present. He who controls the present controls the future. It's kind of very gender-skewed analysis of that. But still, the battle over the past is always about the present, and it's about rationalizing a particular state of affairs that we see in the world right now. And so, if you can diminish the claim of what racism and white supremacy have done in the society, you automatically and implicitly diminish the moral claim that people who are the descendants of those groups have in this country right now. And so that's what the ballgame is right now. And also, if you can muddy the waters around how difficult it has been for people to achieve citizenship, you can do things that make it more difficult for them to gain access to the vote. And so all of these things are about rationalizing present policies.
And we are going to talk to you more about all of this. Jelani Cobb, please stay with us. We are going to talk about Christian nationalism, right-wing politics, and whether Ron DeSantis would like to teleport the country back to 1787. Stay with us.